Hello everyone, welcome back to another chess video. We have a lot of information to get into, so I don't want to delay the intro too long. I really want to just get right into it because we have a lot in this game to cover. A lot of little instructional moments here and there sprinkled throughout. So without further ado, I do want to get to those key moments. Now, as a little context right before I do, I will say that this game is a fairly old game that I'm about to show. Nothing like 1900, early 1900s. It's not like we're looking at a Capablanca or Morphy game. But this is fairly old for, my standards here. So without the little joking aside on how old it is, this is from 2021, which is about 2 years old. And this is one of my own games. This is also the same game that I referenced in the last video when we looked at the double Fianchetti, that Fianchetti setup, Fianchetti plural for fianchetto. And in this game, Black will do that exact playstyle strategy here, where they're going to adopt this setup and they're really not going to get a good position from it. And so we're going to take a look at some instructional ways that we can actually take advantage of this. So, alright, so back then I was about 1900, so was my opponent. I think they were slightly higher, but I just rounded down to 100. I don't know the exact numbers. This was an online game back then. So, alright, I start with pawn to d4, looks pretty normal. They play g6. Many good setups that could happen with this. Some kind of King's Indian, some kind of Perk defense, maybe some kind of other Indian transposition like a Grunfeld or something. Many options here. So I play c4, they go bishop g7, knight c3, all super solid so far. Now we get to something that I consider a bit of a mistake here. So in this position, my opponent played pawn to b6. And already with this third move, they're practically shouting their intentions that they're going to play this Fianchetti opening by fianchettoing both bishops. And as we might recall from the last video, I'm not really a fan of this for some positional reasons. Essentially, it's a very slow setup because you're taking a lot of moves. You had this pawn move, you had this bishop move, and you're going to do the exact same on the other side. And half of those are pawn moves. And not only that, but you're also weakening your position because maybe there will be some pawn levers here, and you can rip open the position on either flank. So you don't really want to set yourself up for potential long-term weaknesses in the future. One fianchetto, there's some weaknesses, but maybe we could deal with it. But two, I think, is just a little bit too ambitious, and these extra pawn moves means they're not developing pieces, and with that little time that they're wasting, maybe we can control the center, and then they're just without the center. Now, to show some alternatives to b6, because I think there's some better moves here. So one of them that calls, to my attention is maybe like c5. I think c5 is a decent idea. Strikes in the center, logically, might transpose some kind of Benoni defense, maybe some kind of Leningrad Dutch. There's a lot of options it could go into. Of course, knight f6 is another very popular option. Probably going to go into something like a King's Indian. Maybe if we play like e4, d6, knight f3, castles, and we're just in normal mainline King's Indian defense theory here. But that's not the only option. I even think another interesting idea is, instead of c5, interesting pawn lever, you could even try e5 here. And I think e5 is actually possible. And the point is that if white accepts this pawn, you can actually sacrifice it with knight f6. And I think it's a really interesting type of position if you really like that sacrificial type of gameplay. But what all of these options have in common, that b6 does not, is back here, all of these moves fight for the center, whether it be knight f6, e5, c5, but b6 is a little slow in that. And one could argue that maybe they're trying to contest the center by, the long diagonal with this bishop, but this takes time, and we're not really going to give them that chance because we're going to grab the center first. So, of course, we play e4. We don't want to let this opportunity go by. Our opponent is gifting us the opportunity to take the center, and so we don't want to delay moves and play something else. We want to grab the center while we still have that opportunity. So here, my opponent did something else a little strange, but I don't think it's as bad of a move as it looks. They played pawn to c6, and I think there was still a chance to return to some normalcy. I think they could have played like d6, and I think they would be okay. But I don't think c6 is as completely terrible as it looks, because if they go bishop b7 here, this pawn can always move. It can always advance to c5, which I did mention earlier, so, they wasted a tempo, but it's not so terrible. But also, this pawn on c6 is actually stopping me from gaining even more central space with pawn to d5. And so maybe I thought, my opponent might have been a little concerned, back here, that maybe I was going to advance and then just slowly cramp their position. And sometimes that happens when you play a kind of a passive setup, something like this fianchetto with both bishops. oftentimes the opponent will get a really, great advantage in the center, and maybe they kind of changed their plan mid-game and thought, I don't really want to allow that. I'll play c6, I'll get my bishop developed, and then maybe I can push this pawn when my bishop is controlling d5. Another reason I thought that is because, we're still in the opening. My opponent took a few extra seconds here, maybe even a minute on this move. So that's why I think they were probably changing plans. Maybe they didn't like something. But again, I think d6 and they were probably okay instead of c6. But it's not the end of the world. And another drawback with this move, most people might think, is that it blocks the natural square for the knight. And although this is true, I don't think that's really a big deal here, because if they fianchetto, this knight wants to go to b7 to d7, or sorry, b8 to d7 anyway. And the reason why we've mentioned this in the last video with the Fianchetti setup is that if they were to have a knight here and their bishop fianchetto in this normal structure, oftentimes you'll want to have a knight positioned this way. And this is good for the king side, because in case they lose this knight on f6, they can always recapture with their own knight and maintain this good control over the central squares. If that is somewhat unfamiliar, you might want to check out my last video where I go a little bit more in depth into what squares that controls and why that's important. But without going too deep into this, you can check that out if you like. But we're just going to kind of mosey on over to the next move. So here, what I thought was a really instructional moment. I actually played pawn to h4. And this looks really strange to most people because they really want to play normal moves like knight f3, bishop b3, bishop f4, maybe even bishop e2. And I think all these developing moves are completely fine, completely playable, and I think white is slightly better. But here, this h4 idea, this is something I've come up with that I've seen thematic in many other openings, where black plays really passive, and where they have this little, hat formation in this fianchetto. And the reason this is important is because what's the drawback of our opponent playing this, slow setup? Well, we can have time to get the center. Yes, that's the biggest drawback. But there's also one other drawback, and that's because they're taking so long to develop their pieces. I mean, they literally only have one piece developed, this bishop. Because they're taking so long, we're not really punished in using pawn moves that are useful. And so I have time to play h4 and try and go h5 and rip open lines of attack. Now, many might be wondering, why don't I just get developed? Why am I thinking this pawn move is useful? Shouldn't I be developing instead of pushing pawns myself? And to some extent, that's true, except this is a useful move for a very instructive reason, and that is they played b6 and they played c6. And this is very weakening to their queen side. We can imagine if their king was to castle queen side and it'd be on c8, these pawns so advanced right here is really not the shelter they want. They would much rather have these b6 and c6 pawns back on c7 and b7 and keep some kind of close shelter to their king. But because those pawns have advanced, it's very unattractive for them to castle queenside. Now, because of that, I can almost know for either certainty their king is going to be in the center, or they're going to castle kingside. And they probably don't want their king in the center, especially, as slow of a setup as they have, so few pieces developed. So they're probably going to go kingside. And if they go kingside, that means I'm essentially launching a pawn storm before they even get castled over there. And we can only do this because we're pretty certain they're going to get castled kingside or not castle at all. So this is a little bit more of an advanced topic where you kind of think of what their drawbacks are and then try and exploit it. But this is the idea behind h4. So okay, so they continue with their setup. They play bishop to b7. Now this Fianchetti is official. They have now fianchettoed both bishops. And, they got their setup that they wanted. It's a bit slow. White has the center, but it's not the end of the world. Still have a lot of work left to do here. Now, in this position, I think that they probably could have played h5 and probably still been okay. I think white would have still been better because white has the center, but I think that was probably a better chance than what actually happened in the game. So maybe one line could be something like, because I played h5, but let's say instead of the bishop here, let's say they go h5 themselves, just to stop my idea. Because if they don't try and stop me from playing h5 myself, I think they're probably just playing with fire. I think it's a little bit too dangerous. But maybe one line could go something like this. You just develop. Maybe the d6 move I wanted. Say white just keeps developing, black keeps developing. And I think, white is maybe slightly better because of center, but it's not the end of the world, and at least my pawn is fixed on h4. Now, as we'll see in the game, what actually happened is when they didn't play this move, I get to play h5 myself. And for players of the King's Indian attack, or the King's Indian defense, King's Indian attack too, there's also similar patterns with this idea for white. But specifically the King's Indian defense, whenever they have this, castled idea, there's a lot of h4, h5 ideas in some of the lines. So this might be familiar to those players, but the idea is you're literally just ripping open the center because, we have the center and we want to open lines of attack. And whether we open the center where the king is at or whether we open where it's about to castle, we're trying to get lines of attack for all of our pieces. So we play h5. They play d6, which I thought was an okay move. We played h takes. And here they actually went with f recaptures. I think h was slightly better. I'm guessing my opponent didn't really want to trade rooks. But I think it was probably better to allow this capture towards the center, which is generally what you should be doing because the center is valuable in chess, and usually your pawn should be capturing in this direction. So here, it would just go like this. We would trade rooks. And maybe my opponent wanted to avoid this because maybe they thought they wanted to get castled kingside or something, or just want to keep the rooks on the board. But here I think, white might have a slight advantage, but I don't really think it's much. And yes, black's castling situation is still unresolved, but at least they've traded off potential rooks, to attack. Maybe this h rook could have been a very valuable attacker with my h file open. At least they've gotten rid of a potential attacker. So I think h takes was a little bit more accurate, but, it's not the end of the world. They played f takes. It's still not completely terrible. We can see by the evaluation here that white is a good amount better. But part of that is because we have a nice center. I don't think they're like completely losing right off the bat right away. So we just keep developing. We play bishop e3. They play knight to d7. And I think anything reasonable, I think black is a little bit behind to white, but, they're not completely losing yet. Now, because of that, I sat there for a few minutes on this move, and I thought, okay, how do I actually want to make progress? Because I could keep developing, but where are my pieces going to be best located? And I thought, well, maybe at some point, maybe I want to castle queenside, maybe something like queen d2 and get castled. That's a possibility. I also want to think, where do I want my other pieces on the king side to get developed? I mean, my rook is probably okay on the half-open file, but what about this bishop and knight? Where do I really want to put them? This bishop, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's useful in e2, maybe reinforcing some pressure on this diagonal. Maybe bishop d3 is needed to help maybe a little more active towards the center. But then I'm also cutting off defense of my d4 pawn. It's still defended by my bishop, but it might become a target as well. So I'm not really entirely sure with the bishop. So process of elimination, I either want to get castled queenside or develop this knight. And so I think, well, where does this knight actually, really want to go? What's its dream location? And I thought, I actually would really like to go to this e6 square. I mean, if we can get to e6, and especially if this pawn is back on e7, we can really cramp the opponent, and their king might actually be stuck in the center. And so I thought, well, how can I actually get to this square? And I thought the best way to do it was knight h3. And this is what I played. Because if I was to go knight to e2, I'm blocking my bishop, and I'm also blocking the queen in some lines, and I don't really want to block my other pieces. And furthermore, if I were to go here and here with knight f2, or sorry, knight f4, yeah, I'm going to e6, but that's my only route there. But from h3, I have a few extra options. I can go to f4, or I can go to g5 in some lines. And maybe I'll end up on e6 this way. But maybe the knight will actually be good on one of those squares without having to go there. So it's just a little bit more flexible to develop the knight this way, I thought. But these are just hopeful ideas. Sometimes my dreams come true for the knight. Doesn't mean it'll always get to e6, but, it's a good idea and you can still strive for it. It's good to have some plan in the, position. My opponent plays a regular move. We play knight f4, queen d7, probably trying to keep my knight out of the e6 square. I play d5 to try and get some more control over this square. And here I think my opponent made a blunder. They played c5, which probably had the idea of trying to keep the center closed. But I'll show that if they were to go c captures d5 and c captures d5, I'm thinking maybe they really didn't like the open c file. Because if they wanted to get castled queenside, they haven't gone kingside, so maybe they're trying to go queenside. Maybe this is a lot less appealing to them because they've opened up this c file. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe they played c5 just to try and keep things closed, and then maybe, castling isn't as terrible. But their king is still very open. These pawns are very far advanced. So that's a queen there. It looks like a pawn. That's a queen. Pawn here. But, realistically, their home pawns are these three. And this is very far advanced. So if the king was to go here, this is a lot of open space, especially like along this diagonal. They could get attacked. Maybe we could get an attacker on a7. These are a lot of threats that black really would prefer not to deal with if they had their pawns in a nice line very close to the king for a shelter. But okay. So now that they played c5, yes, the center is closed, but we have knight to e6. And this was our dream. We actually got there. Look at that outposted monster on the 6th rank. I mean, this thing is just a beast. It's outposted, it's beautiful, controls 8 squares, 4 of which are very deep in the enemy camp. This is just the kind of dream piece that you wish. Knights dream of these kind of things, so I'm very happy to be here. Very nice location. Now, their bishop is attacked, so they have to either retreat the bishop or play king f7. I mean, realistically, there aren't too many other things they can really try. So they go bishop to f8, probably forced, realistically. And so here, I think, well, in these types of positions, because the center is very close for the most part, and especially because we have this outposted, knights tend to be better, because the position is so close. If the position was a lot more open, then maybe the bishops, and especially the bishop pair, are very valuable. But here, because knights are so good, I think, okay, well, this knight is amazing. How can I improve this other knight? Because this is a potentially really good piece. And so, in closed positions, how can I improve it? Well, I can go forward here, knight to b5. And this looks really good. Immediately, I'm threatening this knight fork, because I'd fork the rook and the king. And so, this is just something they immediately have to address if they don't want to lose material. So, what's the only move they can really try? Well, pretty much, they have to play like rook c8, just to stop this. But now, here comes the problem. Now I can just take on a7 and attack the rook that just defended the c7 square. So now they must move the rook. And now my knight comes back. And you might think, well, okay, I've won a single pawn, that flank pawn. It's not a huge deal. But if we compare this to the position just earlier, this is a big difference. Because here, my knight can actually be chased away by them playing a6 at some point. However, when we take this and come back, now this knight is actually outposted. And they can't actually get rid of my knight now. There's no pawn that they can kick the knight away with. And we even have the immediate threat of even coming here to c7 if we really wanted. So now my knights are both very strong, and I'm very happy with this for this closed position. So okay, so they go rook c8 because they didn't want me to bring a knight into c7. Very logical. And I'll just keep developing. So I'll play queen to f3 here. They play h5. I go bishop d3. Knight to h6. And, white's space advantage is just very nice. We just slowly cramp black. And we have all the time in the position to improve. All the time in the world to improve our position. Here, I mean, black can't really do much. You can notice they're basically in Zugzwang. I mean, this bishop can't move. If it goes g7, we'll lose it. And I'm not going to trade it right away, but it's stopping this rook from getting active. This knight can't really do a ton. This square is controlled by my pawn. They really have a lot of options taken away. His bishop is looking at granite. This rook isn't doing a ton other than defensive duties to c7. The queen and king seem buried in the center. And so because black can't really do much, I can actually play really patiently here. I think a lot of players will make the mistake of thinking, I have a really good position. I have to go in really quickly, really attack, go in with everything. And, maybe you can get away with that. But why not improve everything? Why not get your king castled first? Why not develop all of your other pieces? Or at least get a bunch active, and then you can cash in on your attack. And so here I thought, I'll just play a very calm move. I mean, they're trying to develop. This pawn also looks weak. I could keep developing. I think it's also very solid. But you know what? I'll just play queen g3. Very simple move. I'll just attack this pawn. And they have to address this. That'd be checkmate in one. Well, not in one, because they can block the knight. But they would lose a pawn and be pinned. And this is just a lot they really have to deal with. So I thought it was a simple move. We'll play it. It doesn't really hurt my position. Now, I think a really cool alternative, which I didn't see in the game, but this would have been really nice, was instead of this queen move, I could have actually gone e5. I think it's a really interesting idea to open up this diagonal for the bishop. And maybe something could go like this. We could take, knight f7, and then bishop captures f7 would have been a really pretty checkmate, really nice finish. And that's just one sample line to show you just how dangerous this position is for black. So e5 would have been a nice find, but we played this queen g3, also harmless. And here I think my opponent was just in desperation because They tried to sacrifice bishop captures d5 just to try and remove the defender of my knight. I recapture. I capture with the e pawn and not the c pawn because I want to open up the diagonal for the bishop just like before. But here, if I was to recapture with the c pawn, I might actually allow black to play pawn to c4. And I really don't want to give them a counterplay because now they're attacking my bishop and now I've lost the initiative. So with e captures d5, I'm keeping the attack alive and I'm not giving them a chance to fight back because they're in a really bad position. Why allow counterplay if I don't have to? So they have a really big threat on the g6 square because we're threatening checkmate soon. So to avoid the checkmate, they went knight to f7 here just to get out of the way and block this so this isn't a check they have to address later. And I think queen captures was pretty strong here, but I preferred to capture with the bishop because I thought if I take with the queen, maybe my queen can get chased away, something like rook g8 or something. I just thought, I would prefer to go in with the expendable bishop, and maybe at some point I could even trade it for the knight. I am up by a lot of material, so there's nothing wrong with trading down if that's what I want to do to reach an endgame. So they develop, try and pin the bishop to my queen. I think I'll take with check, so they have to react to this. They take back, and now we'll just move the queen. Very calm move. King e8, trying to get the king a little safer. And paradoxically, my king is in the center, but my king is really safe because they have no pieces around to attack it. Now, compare that to black's king, where it's also uncastled in the center, but they can never castle because they've moved both the rooks, and they're just in a lot of danger here because I have this really nice knight and a lot of pieces that can swarm into the attack. All these pieces here could be potential attackers, and my rooks could also get into the game. So even though the center is fairly closed, fairly locked, I think white's king is fairly safe because the center is closed and because they don't have attackers here. I think I'd be in a lot more trouble if the center was open. In that case, I should really have been castled many moves ago. But okay, here we'll just take with rook captures h5, win a pawn, try and get our rook a little more active. Now, of course, they can't take this because if they were to take, this is going to be a checkmate in 2. Have to block, and then here, and this is checkmate. So, of course, they see that, and they don't take my rook. And so they play the queen over. We play rook h5, king d7, trying to untangle themselves. And we'll just play very calm here. We'll just go bishop to d2, just so we can relocate our pieces, because why not? They try and improve their bishop. And now I get my bishop to c3, a little repositioning. And now I can think, well, I'm up by a good amount here. Now I can start to go after the king. Now a lot is active. So I start sacrificing here. Well, more trading, not really sacrificing. And the whole idea is I'm just removing defenders near their king. So I capture on f6, they recapture. I sacrifice the rook here because their king is so open. They try and give a check first, but I'll just drop back. Very calm move. They try and get their rook into the game. Of course, I have to be careful with the skewer. But here I'll just castle queenside. And I'm in no problems whatsoever. This pawn is defended by the knight, and my king is really safe. But that's only half of it. The other half is this rook is also getting active. Maybe this rook can get into play. So they finally capture my e6 piece. I capture back. We're still up a lot of material. They have a lot of threats on their open king to deal with. They try and defend by moving the rook back. I'll just go queen f5, king e7, step themselves out of the pin, and I'll just bring the other rook into the game. They try and attack my queen. I bring in the rook. And then here they resign, one move away from the inevitable. I guess they didn't want to see either king to e8, and then we have this checkmate with queen captures f8. That's a checkmate in 1. And the other checkmate in 1 is they can block with the rook, rook to f7, but then we can also play queen captures f7, and this is also checkmate. We shouldn't forget this square is also controlled by the knight, so they can't really escape that easily. And so, this was a game where really black didn't have a ton of play. And I think a lot of it had to stem with really their setup at the very beginning. I think that the Fianchetti setup is a bit questionable. It seems like the bishops are competing, and it's a bit slow to set up. One fianchetto on one side of the board, and maybe you can get away with it. But with 2, I just feel like it's a little bit too ambitious. I'm not saying that all openings that use that is bad, but it's got some drawbacks, including the opponent can take the center because it's a bit slow, and you're opening yourself up to all these pawn levers. If you're advancing on the edge of the board, you can rip open lines of attack by the king. So I think they got into some trouble there. And then, of course, we got a really nice knight outposted on e6. And, they were never able to castle because of that. So, really, I mean, these h2, h4, h5 ideas on the king side, same thing with a2, a4, a5 on the queen side, if they were to castle that way. These can be some very powerful ideas. So these pawn moves can really strike like lightning. Just a single tempo is so critical in these pawn storms. So why not get a head start and launch your pawn storm before they even get castled, if you're for sure which way they're going to castle. Now, I will go back to one thing here. And now, earlier in the game, I thought instructional moment was, here with h4. And, this is the position we're talking about, where, of course, we could rip open lines of attack this way. But one detail I wanted to comment here was, in this position, h4 is good, but even a4 is okay. And it's for the same reason. This doesn't look as intuitive to people, because h4, h5, I think some people might realize, like, oh yeah, ripping open lines on this, the king, we might get some lines of attack here. Opens the h file for a rook, if we were to go this way. Now the rook is really in nice shape, but also maybe this bishop could come into play, defended by the rook on h1. So these are a lot of options with the pawn move. What they might not realize as easily is, well, the same exact thing actually applies here. If we were to play like a4 hypothetically, this a4 move, if we look at the analysis here, the engine, we're still like 0.7, 0.8. Yeah, 0.9 now. And a big part is because white has the center, and so pretty much anything they do, they're slightly better. And, a4 is not really the best move in the world, I think, but it's got the same idea. We can advance a5, we can rip open lines of attack. Maybe we can even get this bishop in, this way, especially if the queen is behind it, like on e2 is some kind of battery or something. And so these ideas are ideas they wouldn't have if we were to go back some moves, if you didn't fianchetto at all. Like if this is a really nice structure here, you got these pawns in a nice line, h4 doesn't really make sense, because I can advance, and I can advance again, but once I advance too far, you just push the pawn, and you keep everything closed. But here, whenever you fianchetto, just once, you play this move here. They play g6. Something like this. h4 is very strong because this pawn is kind of jutting out, and we can create immediate pawn lever. Now, the reason I chose the king side is because I thought they were going to castle king side. a4 is okay, but I think h4 is an exclaim, whereas a4 is just alright. And the reason is because I know the king is going to get castled over here. They're probably not going to get castled queenside. And so I would prefer to attack on the side with where their king is probably going to go. And the reason I say this is because if they fianchetto both bishops, just like they do here, then how do you know which pawn flank to go after? Because their setup is slow, but we might only have time to attack one side of the board. And so usually I'll choose the side where I think they're going to get castled. And because these pawns have advanced, I don't think they're going to castle queenside. And if they do, their king is going to be very exposed there. If this doesn't make sense too much, then I also did another YouTube video on something like why pawn moves in front of a castled king are weak, or something along that effect. And so you can check that out, where these pawns here should be guarding their king, especially these three if they go queenside. And just these small moves, just these little bit, you'll notice how many square weaknesses are now weaker. A6 is now weak, d6 is weaker. A6 is actually a hole, straight out, because it can't be defended by a friendly pawn. And over on the king side, the same exact idea, even for a regular fianchetto. So everything is pros and cons here. And I know this might be a little bit of a deep analysis for some people, but I really want to hammer home these points because, maybe some people will appreciate it, and maybe some people will actually learn from it. And if it's not your style, you don't like this much deep analysis, that's okay. Different things for different people. But for me, when I was first learning chess, I really enjoyed hearing the thought process, hearing the discussion, hearing the conversation. And hearing from stronger players than myself like that really helped me learn. And so just as kind of a service to others, I like to try and offer that same insight to other people. So I hope this deeper analysis helps. Let me know in the comments if this deeper analysis is useful for people, or if you like the shorter style videos. I realize this one's a little bit longer, but it's also an entire game. So let me know what you think in the YouTube comments, and I will see you in the next video.